Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Gloria Browne-Marshall, the author of A Protest History of the United States. She's written a half dozen books, is a professor of constitutional law at John Jay College, and is also a playwright. Thanks so much for being here, Professor.
Thank you.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. One quote on the dust cover of your book jacket is resonating with me. The quote is, "Most of the good in the United States came by way of protest." Before we get to the good, it does seem painfully obvious that we're in the middle of a moment where protest is not a far off thing being conducted by lonely activists on a street corner in front of a government building. Rather, the government has stated its goals clearly. The goal is mass deportation now. Protesters have decided those goals are either unjust or being pursued unjustly. We saw two people who were exercising their constitutional right to protest wind up murdered in plain view. Historically, Professor, what impact has it had on the policy itself in the United States, the policy that's being protested, when the public decides that a protester was needlessly harmed?
It is an amazingly deep and abiding impact when someone is being harmed in the midst of protests. And we can go back to the protests in which, even like from the Vietnam War at Kent State, where college students on the Kent State University campus were killed by troopers in that time period of Vietnam War anti-war protests. It takes the protest movement to a whole other level. When Reverend Reeb in Selma, Alabama, as well as uh, uh, Miss Viola Liuzzo were killed for voting rights, when the three college students who were taking the opportunity to go down south to Philadelphia, Mississippi, around the issue of desegregation, when they were found murdered, it makes it so much more a deepened experience for history as well as for people who are standing on the sidelines watching. And then they see that this is not just a political issue. This becomes an issue of life and death. They begin to think about their own lives. They begin to think about the seriousness of the issue being protested. And it becomes something, not, as I said before, not just a marker in history for that particular protest issue, but also one that turns the tide of a movement. And when we knew that there were people who were dying at the hands of police, the actual video of George Floyd made people realize, well, he was murdered in plain view in the middle of the day, just how wrong the trajectory was on in that particular issue on voting on police violence. And so all of these issues take a turn when lives are lost. And when protests, one way or the other, becomes one of international note because the lives are lost. Now the world looks at the United States and the world is now chiming in. So it becomes what was local now becomes international when lives are lost.
Professor, before we go any further, I just want to mention that AxelbankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, featured episodes, and also a link to the Patreon page I mentioned. So everyone check out Nikki's work. Professor, the First Amendment to the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, of abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. What did the founders say about the right to protest as the First Amendment was being formed, and why did they feel so strongly about it, apparently?
When the U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1787, then it had to be ratified in 1789. The Constitution itself only speaks to the structure of the government. James Madison, considered the father of the U.S. Constitution, had to convince the people that there would be protections for the people against the government they had just created, because there was a fear that government, a centralized federal government, would be too powerful. Prior to 1787, under the Articles of Confederation, each state had its own semi-autonomous way of protecting itself. It had its own military. It had its own currency. It had its own ability to interact with other countries. And so James Madison, upon this promise, said there would be amendments to this document that would give people a chance to stand up against their government and protect themselves against their government. And so we have the Bill of Rights. And we begin, as you have just noted, with the First Amendment, indicating that the right of protest, a word not in the Constitution, but as a combination of those rights you just stated, and especially the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So the other is freedom of the press. And so when you start thinking about these rights to stand up, to assemble, they're actually created after having experienced the lack of those rights and protections under King George. So they wanted to make sure that they would not create a government that would leave them helpless to the government they just created. They feared that someone would somehow combine those three branches of government and create a kingdom, a monarchy again. And so in order to have the power of the people stay there in the midst of the creation of the government, James Madison said, we'll always have the people's power to stand up, to make their arguments, and to meet and make their own decisions about how the government is working, and if it's not working the way the people think it should work, that they can stand up to that government.
The Boston Tea Party has become the most famous early protest in what has become the United States. But how far back does protest go on this continent? Who protested? What were they protesting? And were they allowed to protest?
In my book, A Protest History of the United States, I began with the indigenous protests and resistance. That's how far back. I look at the indigenous, the native peoples, as being the original protesters. When we get to the United States and what we think of as the United States, this year is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. That is a protest document. That document was signed in order for this country to be formed. It broke away as a colony of England. And so when we began our protests, we can start with that document. Even before that, if you mentioned like the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party was a protest against the tax that England was putting on tea, and it involved throwing these crates of tea, of English tea, over the side to indicate that they were not going to tolerate any more taxation without representation, and the taxes were too high, etc. But even with that, the people who protested wore costumes. They dressed up like Native Americans and covered their faces as part of their protest. So they feared retaliation. I think was also symbolic, because they felt like that England was protecting Native Americans too much. So these protests in different ways have taken form since the beginning of the country, as the start of the country is protest.
What were the indigenous protests? I'm curious.
The indigenous protests and resistance, when you go back to the English arrival, which I always say, our country did not begin with the Pilgrims. Did not begin with the Pilgrims. Please stop this myth. Our country begins in 1607 with the arrival of English ships for a chartered colony that was a business acquisition, if you could say this. English people, Englishmen, decided to get a charter from King James, the same King James version of the Bible, King James, and they had a business venture, which was to create a colony that would have a self-sustaining product, and that product would then have money for England, but would also expand the English empire, the same way the French empires and the other empires have been expanded into the New World. But in the ships were the people seeking freedom. They wanted freedom. Those rowing the boats, rowing the ships, they were lower class people, and they were seeking freedom from a life of oppression that they had back in England. So you had these two divergent ideals inside that ship going forward. When they arrived, they decided we're going to start this new land, this new world, and said, but they're doing it on someone else's land. I mean, not owned by them, but they'd been there for a millennia, and the English had, appeared at first that they were arriving to get provisions and then leave. And so the Powhatan Native Americans were like, well, we'll help you with your provisions and then you'll leave. When they didn't leave, when they started to hunt all the game on the land in the hunting area, in this area of Virginia, the Native Americans had to push back. And then when they started to actually kill the Native Americans, it's like, this is going to be our land. That then the battles, and that's something that happens. The Native Americans said, we're battling back. We're going to withhold your ability to hunt here. So that was a protest there. We were talking about, in my book, I talk about selective buying, economic boycotts. Well, that was one of the first boycotts, economic boycotts. They're saying you're not going to be able to hunt on our hunting grounds because we want you to go and we're trying to force you out. So you had the starvation period in the early 1600s and 1608 to 1609. So there were other ways, and that included violence as well.
You say the U.S. is at war with itself, that there is an America and then what you call an arrogant other half called the United States. Is there something about the way the American system works, politically, socially, economically, that makes protest inevitable?
Yes, it's that dual mission from the very beginning. You have the empire building, um, capitalist orientation of those who arrived under the charter of King James. In the ship, the belly of the ship, you had the poor English, Irish, others, indentured servants, those who didn't have the money to make the trip and they gave their own bodies as labor to pay for the transportation. They were seeking freedom and liberty. And so it collides when you have people at the top and they're very much money oriented, and we want the capitalist system. We think about Wall Street. Wall Street existed before the country became the United States. There's been Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. The capitalist part of the country is there, but sometimes the capitalist part too often is crushing of the little people, or the elite decide that the world is meant for us and no one else. And so the rules, the laws, life is built for them, and the people on the outside, the marginalized people, then have to rise up, knock on the doors, demand attention, and say, you have to expand the rights, you have to expand life, you have to increase what we have as our access to what we're looking at as wealth in this country. And so whether or not it's the ability to expand for more rights, is it for a better way of living, where they can live, all of these things become issues of protest as the marginalized people look at the structure of of life in this country and decide that it's not fair that they have so little and other people have so much. So this issue of distribution of wealth and everything, that's been there from the very beginning. And each time people say, when the Constitution, as we said, was created, and you have the Bill of Rights, we had freedom of speech, but for whom? The Constitution was almost a document for the wealthy, and the rest of the people had to protest their way into the protections of the U.S. Constitution.
In your view, what counts as a protest? When does someone go from merely disagreeing with something that the government is doing or not doing and become a protester?
The protest is one, and as I said, it takes many forms, and it could be economic protest, but when that voice is heard, and that's where we go back to the word protest, and when having one's voice heard publicly, it's when the stance is taken and the other side knows the stance is taken. And so if you think of one of my chapters in the book is forming a union. So you have laborers who decide the money they're making. Once again, that system, the people with the money, the corporations at the top, the workers at the bottom, and the workers saying to the people who are the owners of the corporation, whether or not it's the coal mines or the trains or whatever it may be where people are working, we have to have more money. We have to have better working conditions. And they make those complaints known publicly. When it comes to the government, as you've read, the people have the right to tell the government of their grievances. So in telling the government the grievance, that's where the protest comes in. And that could be by letter, or back then it used to be by petition. So they would actually, that's why the Declaration of Independence is in the petition, it's a document that's not only setting out the grievances, but signed by people saying, these are our grievances, this is what we want changed. And then they present it to the corporation or they present it to the government.
Slavery was, of course, something that was protested very, very early on. There were debates about it in the Continental Congress. Uh, how was slavery protested early on, and what did the government? How did the government react, and what impact did those protests have as the U.S. got into the 1840s with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850? How did those two sides intermingle with each other? The protest over this massive violation of human rights versus the government's interest in keeping slavery going.
Well, when we have the government created, they are still looking at how we're going to finance this government. And so slavery becomes the basis of financing the government, financing the country itself. And those people who are in bondage, kidnapped from Africa, I've been to Africa many times. It's far to go get people from another continent and then through force, violence, and murder.
Abduction. Yeah.
Well, I call kidnap
Okay.
because
Yeah.
so to abduct them, to kidnap them, and have them work for free on penalty of death, and to do that to keep the economic engine going, then there, even in the time period of 1787, there were anti-slavery people in men in the discussions in Philadelphia. The framers of the Constitution came to an agreement because the Constitution is a compromise document. Compromise meaning there are all these people with their ideas and they all help frame what the document is. And that's why they decided by 1808 there would be no importation or exportation of people. That wasn't the end of slavery, but it ended the slave trade in 1808. That's in the Constitution. So it was already a notion there that we cannot continue to do this to other people. So not every white male was a slave owner. Many because they couldn't afford any, to enslave, and others because they were against it for religious purposes and other purposes. They decided that this was a wrong thing for the country to be doing. And so there were conflicts within the group back when the Constitution was created. And then you had people like Frederick Douglass, who wrote the infamous speech that is read among people of African descent on July 4th. What to the slave is your 4th of July? So the idea that you're celebrating independence and you have a petition of someone who was a fugitive slave, Frederick Douglass, a statesman, an intellectual, begging people to consider what they're doing in a country that boasts this liberty and freedom, especially symbolized by Independence Day, the 4th of July. And you had people who were, like he did, fugitives because they decided to use escape as a form of protest. You also had those people who were already free, who, once again, as I said before, petitioned petitioned. They would have these signed. It was something that you don't see now. Think of it more like a newspaper, but it was more of a petition. And they would sign their different reasons why that slavery was wrong and what it was doing. It was a diabolical institution. You had others not only who would help, like Harriet Tubman, help people to escape from slavery. You had Sojourner Truth, who was part of women's organizations as a formerly enslaved person, who went to white women who were saying, you should be helping us in these petitions. You should be standing up for enslavement because you don't have rights either. And yet, you talk about, your rights against with men, and you should be thinking about the rights of enslaved. So the Amistad was a ship that was taken over by Senke. It was a slave ship, and he was someone who rose up against slavery on that ship. There were lawsuits. There were people who left the country as in protest, as free blacks as well as those who were enslaved left and went to Canada as part of their protests. So when you think about people who left their countries to come to the United States because of what was happening, the oppression in their country, that happened with enslaved people too. They protested the treatment they were receiving, enslavement in this country, by leaving to go to Canada or to Mexico.
I'm struck by what you say. You say that much good in the U.S. has come from protest, and we are going to get to the good. But as I was putting my questions together for this, I kept thinking about the Confederacy. They thought they were protesting too, the protest of Union control of Fort Sumter. How do we judge when the government is on the side of what's right?
That is a brilliant question, as all your questions have been. But that one, I think, it goes to the core of the argument people make about, for example, I have a women's chapter in my book, A Protest History of the United States. And there are those who will say that abortion is wrong, it's a taking of life, and they're protesting as pro-life. You have people who are protesting and saying you have female autonomy and abortion is not wrong. It's a woman's choice, and they're protesting pro-choice. And there's always going to be a back and forth on this.
Right. I mean,
England,
January 6th was a protest. Yeah.
well, some people think, well, this is where I have a concern. January 6th, the protesters, so-called protesters, and I call that a lynch mob. So when you say, how do you go from not just right and wrong as far as the issue, how do you go from, if you have a Ku Klux Klan lynch mob, is that a protest because they are
Right.
anti-desegregation?
Once you go into violence, is it's and taking over government property, the protest has ended.
Well, also you have to think, is someone who kills their spouse because the spouse is decided to leave, are they protesting the spouse's decision, the end of a marriage? Some of
Right. There's
these
a clear
things,
difference, clear distinctions there. Yeah.
well, some of these aren't clear to a lot of people. And that's
Right.
why we have issues right now around January 6th. Some people are thinking that they can do whatever they want to do. Are we protesting poverty by robbing the bank? It's like you start thinking about the use and abuse of protest and extended to a whole other level. So yes, and there have been people who have robbed banks and saying, well, we have to finance our protest movement, and so that's why we can rob this bank. So that actually took place in our country. So I think it's when we get to what human behavior is to want to cover something that's for their cause. And that's why in my book I focused on more of the progressive protests, because one, it became very difficult for me to interview people who would actually say, I'm protesting desegregation because I believe in racial purity. People used to say things like that, but they stopped saying things like that out loud. They don't want people to say that they believe these certain things. I mean, even book bans. On the one side, book bans are actually protesting the content of the book. What's in the book? Oh, the book is talking about slavery. The same talk we're having right now. If that's written on a piece of paper in a library, is banned. that students are not allowed to hear what you just said about what happened in protesting slavery, that slavery was bondage, that it was kidnapping, abducting people from another country. They are not being taught any of that. And they're in the protest of those parents, it upsets my child. So therefore, it can't be taught.
I want to ask about you and your process a little bit. You've written many, many books at this point. You've written books about how the law impacts race relations, about the struggle of Black women, about the NAACP and voting rights. At what point did you decide that protesting at large needs to be in one volume?
There are so many different books on protests and on protesters. And I was hearing so often from young and others, that protest doesn't work, it's not effective. Why do people even do it? We need to move on to something else. Why don't we have social media? We don't need to have people in the streets. We can just send the information around by email or Instagram. And I thought about the people who had dedicated so much of their lives, like Tom Hayden at University of Michigan, like Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi. I think about Frederick Douglass. I think about Mother Jones, in the labor movement in coal country in West Virginia, where I traveled to talk to people down there about it. And I thought, we need to know what protests has really done for the country as a whole, and not just look at the individual protests and protesters, because there's a bigger picture. And most of my books, as you pointed out, those that you've named and others, I look at this country over hundreds of years, not as a survey, but as a point of practice. As somebody with a law background, we're taught in civil rights cases, social justice cases, a pattern and practice. Is there a pattern and practice? And so what I want to show is a pattern and practice of this country when it comes to protests, what people did to protest, what we gained by the protest, and how the country reacted to the protest, so that people can see the arc of this issue, not just the individuals. But I had to make sure that it was storytelling, because protests, initially when I was writing the book, it was going to be a legal argument. I was going to argue the legal argument for protest. And then I realized most protests don't have a legal side to it. They don't have a case that you can just read the case, or be defined by the case. So at that point, I wanted to actually interview people who were activists, to show what they did at the time, but also what they were feeling when they were doing this, to understand the right of protests as something that had danger to it, but also had a humanity to it.
Historians on our show have often told me about this kind of wrestling match that they have with themselves over how to keep their own emotions and their own emotional connection either away from the book or to let it infuse the book. I'm wondering, how did you land on that? Did you have to work? Did you try to work to keep your emotions and connections to activism away from the writing here? Or did you find that it could be a fuel for this work?
I did something that historians, and I'm a legal historian. My background is in law, and so law, you're supposed to keep your feelings out of it for the most part. Writing about history, you're supposed to keep your feelings out of it. And that's what I was doing when I wrote the first draft of this book, and I met with my agent and my editor, and they both said it needs something. It needs blood, it needs spirit, because that's what protest is. Even the cover of the book, we decided, has to be like a messy look, because protest is not linear. Protest is not something that you can really like protest neatly on Friday and see the result on Monday morning.
Yeah,
That's
right.
not how protest works. And so therefore I had to look at different ways to tell the story of protest, not just select over 500 years. And so I decided to use memoir, which of course
Yeah,
you're not
you even
supposed to
mentioned
do.
your early memory of a protest. Yeah, explain that.
Yes.
Explain your earliest memory of a protest. That was very
I
cool.
mean, It was in the third grade, and we were protesting for the passage of a tax levy. Now, in the third grade, I did not know the intricacies of the tax system, but we were told that if this tax levy passed, then the schools would have more money, and that would help us as students. And so the teachers actually explained it to us, and therefore, their salaries, I realized later, would also be increased with the tax levy. And so it was really a political experience. It was experience on so many different levels. Every time I look back on that time period of marching in the street with a sign,
And where
vote
was
for the
that?
levy. That was in Kansas City, Missouri,
Uh-huh.
and to vote for the levy, for the tax levy, and it stayed with me all this time. And I just give a shout out to all of my teachers who have helped me and so many others have these great experiences that we don't realize we've had until years later. But that was my first protest, was marching in the street, chanting a little song that I came up with, vote for the levy. And so, and then it lost. It didn't pass. And I was devastated as we watched on the news and it didn't pass. And I thought, that was you think about protests and you think the ups and downs of protests. I mean,
What
that
was
was
all this
my
for?
down.
Yeah,
Yeah, what
right.
was it all for? And why didn't people get it? And going back to what you said before, how is it that you can have people on the other side who didn't see the urgency of this, didn't see that it was necessary? So I learned back then that there's going to be another side that sees life differently. Those corporate leaders didn't just say, I'm going to have you work fewer hours and I'm going to make less profit because I just feel like that's a great thing for me to do. No, you had to have the laborers come together and demand higher salaries, demand better working conditions. And, the rights that we have, voting rights, didn't fall out of the sky for women, for people of color. No, they had to go protest for those things. And so I think too much of what we enjoy every day, we believe good people, Santa Claus, somebody just gave us those rights, not knowing there's another side of the story where there are people who don't see that these rights are necessary for the masses or voting or anything else. And they want to keep life the way it is. And that structure is always going to be giving people protest on one side and then the other pushback on the other side.
You're an accomplished playwright as well. I'm wondering, how are plays useful tools for expressing the thoughts and feelings of injustice?
Evan, I'm telling you, I just love your
Oh,
questions.
thank you. That's very nice. That's very
No,
nice.
it's not just nice because I am an artist, and very few people look at the protests in the artistic work. And so when you think of Angels in America as this huge stage play in New York City that talked about gay rights, talked about HIV, brought these issues to the stage for people to better understand them. When you think about A Raisin in the Sun, that was a play by Lorraine Hansberry that spoke about segregation and the brutal poverty that was inflicted upon Black people in ghettos. You think about so many ways in which music and paintings, so much that has happened in the world of art and sculpture that will help people on a visceral level to better understand humanity's inhumanity. And so I think artists have always had their fingers on the pulse of what's going on. Their ability to have that artwork actually shown to the public, that's different right now with New York City, a place where there should be more art that is speaking to what's going on in our society right now, not happening. What you're seeing are a lot of feel good plays, a lot of feel good revival musicals. You're not seeing the art world actually taking its stance that it should as a place, a platform for artists wherever, whether playwrights like myself or poets or people in the visual arts to actually make their stand so that people can better understand the situation that we're in. They're lagging behind, which is unusual, but I'm talking more about the platforms for the arts, the theaters that are lagging behind as opposed to the artists. I'm sure the artists are depicting this time period in their form of art, but where can they go to actually show the art? And so that is something that is a conflict between the need for the art to be seen by the public and the places that are still too afraid to actually show the art. That's why the Kennedy Center and the National Endowment for the Arts, the battleground there is something that shows that when people look at propaganda, and propaganda is part of protest, and the propaganda is the way in which the messages are told, and art is an excellent conduit for messaging. And that's why artists have always been feared by regimes, feared by authoritarians, because artists can get to the people where propaganda may fall short.
How do you wrestle with, or not wrestle with, but how do you bounce between styles of writing from prose and book writing to dialogue and being a playwright? Is that a challenging thing for you?
I think I'm so blessed that I have the need to do both. And so when I think about a topic, just like protest, I think about, should it be a play or should it be an article? Should it be an essay? And I decided to make it a long form book. And I'm telling you, this might be my last long form book because
Isn't writing
it's,
fun? Historians
oh
always
my
say, look, it
goodness.
sounds fun after the book is done.
Oh, and I had a wonderful book tour. I went to 23 states last year,
Wow.
and I'm meeting people like you. And so the book is taking me these places, but it was a pound of flesh to get it into existence. And it was changed. The structure of it changed. Going back to your other question, the structure had to change like 5 times. Should it be in chronological order? Should it focus on one person and have that person as the focus of the storytelling of protest? And, I wrote this book because of the protesters I knew, the activists I knew. Did I wanted to stay in the contemporary time period? Did I want to go all the way back 500 years? And then how do I connect those things? And so each chapter, the 8 chapters, from indigenous to slave to women's rights to labor, anti-war, up to climate change and police and violence, within each chapter, it has to be structured over time. And then each chapter is structured in an overarching way for time and to show us how things have evolved. So it was something that was very painful, very difficult. And I don't know if I would want to at this point write another book like this again. I think I might do something more in theater right now
Yeah,
to
do
kind
some
of,
art. Yeah, there you go.
yes.
Because art is all about your choices. Um, yeah, let's get back to the topic a little bit. You say in the book that men did not realize the error of their ways and magnanimously hand rights to women. Christians were not visited by 3 ghosts and become convinced that wars should end. You say that the indigenous land was not returned or treaties respected based on the goodwill of the federal government, and litigation and demonstrations forced the recognition of rights under law. You say that's not what happened. What did you discover from reporting this book about when protests finally broke through? In other words, what were the common factors in how protests broke through and then the changes that they were seeking?
Protests take time. And I think that is one of the elements that is largely forgotten. And what I've learned is that it's probably a traumatizing effect on the country, on the protesters. And sometimes when we've gone through trauma, the first thing we want to do is forget it. And so we wake up with the 8 hour work day. We wake up with a 40-hour work week. Wake up with voting rights, but we don't want to think about how they came about. And so the time, the tenacity, to stay in the game in the long run and to know that protest has incremental victories. And because you can't point to one particular victory, like we have the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but we don't think about the incremental victories leading up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We don't think about the changing of poll taxes by changing the Constitution that took place. We don't think about these other lawsuits that took place that leads up to that. So we have to say tenacity, time, as well as the messaging has to stay there. And coming together, people, not just those affected, but those outside of the affected group, also have to be persuaded to do what they can wherever they are.
So
So that's
yeah,
it.
so I mean, I was going to ask, there were many, many anti-lynching protests in the 1900s and early 1910s, and into the 20s in the United States. What did civil rights protesters of the 1950s and 60s learn from those anti-lynching protests?
that if you make a logical, linear legal argument around an emotional issue, too often you're not going to get the end result you want. People are burning another human being alive without sake of trial based on rumor alone in this country. Lynchings, over 4,000 of them took place. If you have a chance to go to the Equal Justice Initiative that's down in Montgomery, Alabama, they actually have the documentation on many of these people who were lynched in this country, just torn from jails, torn from their homes, hanged, shot, destroyed lives. And if you have a legal argument, you should not do this because it's wrong. We did not get an anti-lynching federal law until the Emmett Till anti-lynching law that took place after George Floyd's murder, after all the legal arguments. So I think that what they missed was that there are people out there, they feel they're good people, who didn't have a problem with lynching. And those good, so-called good people refused to support an anti-lynching bill that had started, the activism started in the 1800s and was not passed into law. And much to my, dismay, that the bill has not been used. In Buffalo, New York, when someone went into that grocery store in Buffalo, New York, and just started to slaughter Black people, that should have been a trigger for the Emmett Till anti-lynching law, and it wasn't. So we have now this law on the books, and people don't want to use it. So I'm concerned, when it comes to how long the arc can be. Yeah, the Martin Luther King said, yeah, the arc bends toward justice, but sometimes it doesn't reach it. And that's when it comes to the anti-lynchings bill and bills from before, state level as well as federal level, the use of them has not reached the need for them.
When I started as a reporter in the early 2000s, I was kind of thrust into this anti-Iraq war protest kind of thing. And, it was the Bush administration was ramping up their effort to start a war, and they were doing a public relations tour, and protests started. I remember several large protests that I'd covered. I was very young. And I said during a live report that the protesters were protesting the victims who were Iraqi, the people who would be hurt in Iraq by the violence that would be inflicted on their country and their society. And one of the protesters very nicely, I was 20 years old or 19 years old, they very nicely corrected me and said, we're protesting the American victims as well. What impact has the media had on protest and the reaction to it throughout American history?
Heed Their Rising Voices is the article that was published in the New York Times that spoke of the oppression of African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama by the police. That is the basis for the protections of the press. That protest document, Heed Their Rising Voices. Very few reporters know that. There's a copy of it in the New York Times Museum. And I've actually seen the original in the museum. And I was talking with reporters there in the museum when I was visiting. They didn't even know the significance of that document. That's where New York Times versus Sullivan comes from, which is the protection of the media, that they won't be sued for defamation when they're covering political figures. That's the case. That was a protest. That's based on the protests that were taking place in Montgomery. That's the protest document that, if you want to look at it, for the press. Very few people in the media even know that, even though I'm quite sure it's a case that's studied in J school. So, in my belief of going back to George Washington, who was his first term, he was seen as this great person, so great they wanted him to become a king. After going through all that with King George, they asked George Washington to become a king. He said no.
What was all that for? Yeah, I want to become a king.
Yeah. But the press skewered him in the second term. By the end of George Washington's second term, he was ready to go. He was like, I can't, let me go back to my farm, because the press was horrifically, brutal to political figures in most of the early American history. And so the press has played a role there. Of course, there's yellow journalism, where people are just like wanting to have these stories that, that get the people reading them, involved emotionally. But also the press is there to have their own freedom of the press. It's the only occupation that's actually in the Constitution.
Oh,
You
yeah, I
know,
like that. All right. Yeah, beautiful.
and so, but the other side of that has to be that means that the press has to also have rules for itself. And so you'll see the arc of the ethical standards that the press have decided to take on, that they have to make sure when they're covering a story, they cover it in a proper way. But the press has also been the victim and the object of a lot of government shut down and oppression because they are bringing the truth in the Pentagon Papers, and that's why I have Ellsberg in my book as well, and what he did, and Daniel Ellsberg, and what he as part of the Washington Post, and how they fought back against the Nixon administration that tried to undermine the ability of free press.
Just real quick, I want to ask about Vietnam and Iraq. Those protests were both vigorous. Protests to those wars were vigorous, and they were widespread. Um, both wars continued for years. How tough was that for activists to take in each time?
Remember tenacity and time and messaging. What Tom Hayden did was to have teach-ins around the Vietnam War so that people could understand the issues and better grasp why it was important for the war to end. I do argue that those protests led to the end of the war. Those protests led to a president, Lyndon Johnson, deciding not to run for his own, term in office. So those protests were very effective in ending a war. For a nation that's been in war after war after war, to actually have protests, the Iraqi anti-war protests, as well as the anti-Vietnam War protests, were effective. They might not have happened, as they say with Christian belief, he may not come when you need him, but he's right on time. So protests may not end the war when you want it to. It may not be the end that you decided should be there, but protests has ended wars and will continue to do so. And the protests right now are having an effect on the government that we have right now. But the propaganda against protests, calling them domestic terrorists, as they called the protesters in the anti-Vietnam War, unpatriotic. There's always going to be mudslinging against protests. But then at the end, people then enjoy the benefits of the protests. The mothers and fathers enjoyed not having to send their children into war. And then we find out later that the war was not needed and would have been lost anyway. And so when you think about the anti-war protests, people want to feel that their country, their government is doing the right thing, that the lives of their children, their lives have not been sacrificed in vain. But those protesters also are telling people what the government is doing is wrong. And that voice, all the way back to the James Madison, that we have to push back against the government. We were given those rights by the framers to push back against the government, to tell the government you're going down the wrong path. Stop now.
In the mid 2010s, we all experienced the protests and the difficulties surrounding the deaths of Trayvon Martin, of Michael Brown, George Floyd. In the context of the current protests against police violence in Minnesota and other places, how do we view the success of those protests? What did the protesters of today learn from the experiences of the protesters who were protesting the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and George Floyd?
I think we have a difference in leadership. Black Lives Matter, learned a great deal, and others who follow the Black Lives Matter movement were people who learned through Michael Brown and Ferguson and Tamir Rice and many, many others. Over 1,000 people die at the hands of police every year. Over 1,000. Many of them, but not all of them, people of color. And so those people who are protesting the abuses by law enforcement back then are not those people who are in the major leadership of the protests right now. Maybe because the protests this time stemmed from the undocumented, and those people, who were part of the protests around the way in which the undocumented were treated were not exactly the same group. So what needed to be learned by those people today from the past, that's the problem. Too often, people look at their protests as being unique because their issue might be unique in some way, but not understanding that power has certain similarities. And once you learn how to protest against power, then you can use that in other areas as well. So the unions, for example, have their way of protesting around labor, but there's something that can be learned from the unions. And that's why my book, A Protest History of the United States, is one in which people should read, because you don't have to be one who's having a protest around union rights to gain information from what the indigenous people did or what happened during the time period of enslavement. You can use these lessons. And so I hope that people today will learn around the issue of pushing back against power, especially oppressive power and police power, from my book, based on what happened with Rodney King and others. I'm concerned that though people believe that they have to start the fire and learn how to create fire on their own, as opposed to borrowing matches from people who have already been doing this.
Looking to the future here, what impact do you think, and you've written about this in your book a little bit, what impact do you think demographic changes will have on the future of protest?
I'm looking for younger people to understand demographically from that standpoint of age, that although social media is great for getting the word out, human exchanges with other human beings on a human level, it will still be necessary. We've come a long way over, uh, thousands of years, but in the end, the rallies that took place in the earlier part of the year were necessary to build community, to come out of our silos post COVID, and to understand that social media, emails back and forth, Instagram, TikTok, that is only going to be a messaging system. It has to still rely on people coming together, seeing other people as human beings, which we see now. The death of Renee Good and Alex Preedy and Keith Porter and others, that brought the humanity. Those older people that we saw during the rallies now were people who remember their experiences from the Vietnam War era. They're those people who are now able to connect with, if we can, the generations, young, old, different generations racially and geographically. Regionalism is something that divides us. So hopefully those people can come together and see the country is in trouble and that we all need to share in trying to protest to put it on the right track.
Who needs to read this book more, protesters and activists, or those who are in power?
I would say the protests and activists. The people who are in power right now, if they read it, it would only be as a tool to figure out how to undermine more people's rights and how to undermine protests. Their mindset is that of an oppressor intent on putting their stamp on this country in a way in which rights are being abused and the Constitution is being ignored. So I would say the group between the two, it would be the protesters, so that they can see what is necessary and gain creative ways in which they can continue to protest, understanding what other people have gone through over time, and hopefully finding within my book, A Protest History of the United States, ways in which they can stay in tenacity, time, messaging, and persuading people outside of their concerned group that they too are affected and need to join in any way they can. Think of how can I be a part of this, even if it's not carrying a sign in the street.
All right, I got two more for you as we wrap this up. If you could memorialize protesters on the National Mall amidst Lincoln and Jefferson and the Vietnam veterans and Martin Luther King, what would a national memorial to them look like?
I've Brilliant question. I've created in my mind a way to memorialize them through a day, so that wouldn't be one person. And that's why the difficulty of the book remained. I look at Martyrs Day as a day on July 5th where everyone across the country in their jurisdiction, they know who their martyrs are. They know who the people are who gave of themselves to make their communities better. And I would like a Martyr Recognition Day on July 5th across the country. And July 5th, remember, is the day that Frederick Douglass gave his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which is this famous protest speech. And so this would be the day in which we could recognize those people who have given their lives, like Renee Good, given their lives because it's understood that they could have willingly or unwillingly, they were usurped into this. Renee Good did not want to die that day, I'm sure. And just like Rodney King, that becomes a part of protest. And what he didn't lie down. So there are ways in which people can be a part of the protest movement without ever wanting to be. I'm sure George Floyd did not want to be a part of the protest, but also remember, Rosa Parks did not carry a sign. That's not what she's known for. She's not known for a bullhorn, and yet not giving up her seat is a part of protest. So the different ways in which people have contributed can be recognized on July 5th. Protesters, activists, those who have given their lives on July 5th could be martyrs. Recognition Day, Martyrs Day.
Well, if we were aboard, then I would second that. July 5th. It's my mom's birthday, so I'll always remember it. The book is dedicated to two people, your mother, Lady Bradshaw, and your great-great-grandmother, Eliza Broadnax Bradshaw. How did you choose them for this book? What resonates about their lives and their relationships with protest?
My mother used to tell me stories about the relatives who lived with her on a farm in Kansas where she was born and raised. Those relatives had been formerly enslaved. And those stories stayed with me. And Eliza's story, it passed down in our family about how she stood up against her slave masters, was something that I thought, here's my mom, who was this classically trained pianist on a farm in Kansas, and that's where art is flowing through me. So I had to make sure I learned in 2021, and I had to make sure that I recognized what they gave in their indirect ways. And that's why I implore people that can give to the cause indirectly. You don't have to be the person in the street, but give all props to those people because there's danger in standing up. The way my great-great-grandmother Eliza stood up against her slave master, she could have lost her life when she stood up against her slave master back in the 1800s. And so I wanted to recognize their contributions to me, but also their contributions to what I see as protest in direct and indirect ways.
Gloria Browne-Marshall, the author of A Protest History of the United States, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for those great questions, and power to the people.
You got it. Check out the book from Beacon Press and her social media page on Instagram at @GBrownMarshall. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. AxelBankHistory.com was designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and also a link to our Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work, and thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.